Hi, welcome to week 5. Now that we're in, I want to make a note about the readings and where I was going to go today. So as always, you should do the readings before we come. The time period that we're going to be looking at. So for example, that's an interesting translation. All right, so yes, do the readings. Actually should be in a different color. And it was. Shows here black. That doesn't show black there. Translation from PC to Mac. All right, so the readings cover Nubia, Axum, Ethiopia, Carthage. So that time period before there's actually United Europe. And where we left off last week was the beginnings of looking at, for example, I was talking about Aramaic versions of Christianity, how it's an African-based religion. And then when you switch to basically King James, you start looking at how that version of Christianity differs from the original, and then how the narrative of Western civilization comes. So part of where Asante leaves off and where Kelly begins, I'm going to fill in the gap in between those. Because as I said before, the problem with doing a class that starts in 12,000 BC and goes to now in 3 terms is that there isn't a single book that does that. You have to piece it together from different sources. So let's see, Kelly's book, To Make Our World Anew. The first chapter is called The Early. Oh, now that's a trip. I have never seen that. Up here. Okay, so today's lecture, I said, is covering what the readings do not to set context for your understanding of the modern world. Because while it's nice to know about Axum and Nubia, what does that have to do with today? And so hopefully we begin to answer that. So just recapping what we did last week, where this is an actual book, obviously, from Amazon, God's Secretaries, came out several years ago, basically the making of the King James Version of the Bible, and leaves out a lot of stuff, of course, but, you know, we come to expect that. So one of the assumptions that when we talk about in the time period, since we're using this calendar, the Gregorian calendar, which starts in the year 0, which is Christ's birth, any time before the year 0 is basically called prehistory, but there is history there, right? You've been reading about it. So we talk about the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages and medieval times. That's using a point of view from the point of view of Europe, essentially. Just like the Far East is China and the Near East is Turkey and the Middle East, you know, or like Egypt's the Middle East, as if it's not Africa anymore. And Israel, even though the Egyptians conquered all that and influenced all that. So when you talk about Dark Ages, Middle Ages, you know, so this is entirely Eurocentric. It assumes nothing else is going on anywhere else. And the history basically kind of reflects that. So it's basically, the Dark Ages is the period in European history between antiquity and the Renaissance, often dated from AD 476 to 1453, which is basically, if you look at that time period over 1,000 years roughly, or close to 1,000 years, so 476 is essentially the fall of the Roman Empire. And then 1453, it's like, okay, Renaissance, but what else is happening in 1453? And then what happens before Columbus, quote unquote, discovers America in 40 some odd years after that date. So the presumption of Eurocentrism is that if Western civilization is dark, then it was dark everywhere. Or we don't mention it, so it's not important for you to learn. So, well, not quite everywhere else, and I'll begin to show you the everywhere else, and we'll be jumping around the planet, and also a little bit in time sequentially. So everywhere else had civilization, using our definition of civilization as cities, being evidence for civilization. And that's from our bias. I mean, I participated, I don't know if you read local newspapers, but Eugene just had its 150th birthday. So, in the representations of, who was around in 150 years ago in Eugene, so if we use the Register Guard or newspapers in general as the historian, then who was here then? Well, we did have a picture of Native Americans. We did have a picture of pioneers and a discussion about a statue at the U of O called the Pioneer Woman. So whenever I look at those kind of things, whenever I enter a room, I notice who's there, who's not there. Right? Who's there to, as they say in hip hop, represent, and who is represented, and who ain't. So I come from a city, Los Angeles, unabashedly from LA, where its founding fathers, there were 44 of them, only 3 of them were white. The rest were Africans, mixed African and Native, and Spaniards. None of whom we consider white today. So the 3 founding fathers that were of European or Castilian extraction, nobody was making a rule for the white people to leave in the late 1700s when Los Angeles was founded, because it was part of Mexico, which comes from an Aztec word, Mexicatahue, all my relations. So the idea is everywhere else had civilization, and complex urban civilizations with the technology, ability, and will to bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. Because, if you look at where you're writing, you're taking your notes in the Latin character, the Latin alphabet from the Romans, but you're not using Roman numerals to balance your checkbook. So how did an infusion of Arabic numerals occur? Part of that occurred during the Dark Ages. But we're going to look at post-Kemet, pre-Columbus. So really old school African Americans, Afro-Asiatics, and the Moors. So when I myself personally identify as African American, I basically say that's a 2,500-year-old history, not since slavery. So I date it back to the time when we first came here, according to the historical record, as well as the people that were here before us, the natives. So part of the evidence of that, one of the books that the class was built on originally, and the book's hard to get, so rather than give you tons of books to read, I basically just borrowed some of them. They came before Columbus. Ivan van Sertima, he's a historian who came from Guyana in South America, one of the maroon communities there. So his basic thesis in this book, They Came Before Columbus, is that Africans are capable of making the trip from Alkebulan, Africa, to Turtle Island here easily as early as the 22nd to 25th dynasty, around 850 BC, and as late as the era of European exploration in the late 15th century. That his thesis is that it's continuous, and he has some references to talk about that. So, for example, this is one page from his book, and he's basically saying if you consider the currents in the ocean, and he's talking about, so if you look at, they're essentially like rivers in the sea which stretch from the surface to some hundreds of feet below the surface. It's like a giant river. So he pointed out that people, for example, if you started right around here, this is West Africa, where I'd shown you some of the pictures when I took a trip last year. So this is basically Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast. You can take a raft like a mile offshore, and the currents will pick you up and take you to South America in 3 weeks, drifting. Now, it's been proven that people can survive adrift in the ocean for several months. If the currents can take you from Africa to southern Turtle Island in 3 weeks, well, what if you had something more elaborate than a raft? Now, we've already established, so logically, I could be crazy, but logically, if you can build a pyramid and you have longitude and latitude and magnetic compasses and maps, you're already calling Turtle Island, your word for Turtle Island is the circuit of the world, which is the only landmass on the planet that goes from the North Pole to the South Pole, and that's the Comedian word for it. The only way to know that is to sail it, unless you want to say that space aliens took pictures from orbit, which I'm not willing to say. So Van Sertima's thesis, basically, because he says, I'm descended from those very sailors. So, for example, this is an artist representation of a smaller boat. So when we start looking at the era of slavery, where you see the famous graphic of 500 slaves laid out on a deck, that's from a brigantine. That's a warship that's several hundred tons. This boat depicted here is maybe 10 tons, because it's basically got like a shelter in the middle. So he's basically calling this an East African trading ship, a ship of great antiquity. It sailed the Indian Ocean between Africa and China, held together not by nails but by palm fiber lashings. These ships could be as large as 70 tons. The one shown here is from a model in the Fort Jesus Museum in Mombasa in Kenya. Kenya's national language is Swahili. Kiswahili. The Swahili is basically, they're a tribe who speak that language, Swahili, and it's a trading language. So Swahili is to Africa what Latin is to the Roman Empire, what Chinikawawa is to the Northwest, a trade language. Okay, so your language is a trade language, just like Latin is a trade language. If you got conquered by the Romans, you keep your own religion, keep your own language, but if you're going to deal with us, you need to speak Latin. Swahili are not necessarily conquering people, but people use that language as a trade language between them. So that's why, for example, when Karenga invented kawaida, all those words in Kwanzaa are Swahili. Van Sertima says the Swahili transshipped an elephant from China in the 13th century, which means in 1200s. Now, elephants don't like, they can swim, but they don't like boat travel. So the first trading item, if you're going to make first contact with somebody, that ain't going to be an elephant, right? You have to develop a trade for elephants. So the statement is basically assuming, and I'll show you this with pictures, that there is a trade going on between Africa and China for quite some time. Now, Mali, the Malian Empire, where you have here, this is again from Van Sertima, Timbuktu, Gao, Jenne. Timbuktu was basically a college town, a university town. The University of Timbuktu was famous, at least continent-wide, outside of Kemet, and this is also after largely the fall of Kemet. So the Songhai and Malian empires, contiguous, they're close to each other. So if you notice these rivers, that's the Niger River. These rivers, some of them connecting and stretching to the ocean. This kingdom was ruled by a succession of kings, one of which Abu Bakari of Mali, Abu Bakari II. This is an artist's impression. Now, the thing with Abu Bakari, according to Van Sertima, he tells the tale that he was obsessed with what was beyond the sunset, that is west of West Africa. And being a king, and also being possessed of several fleets of ships. These are Egyptian warships made of cedar. So bigger than the artist's impression of what I showed you. Egyptian warships. He sent 2 fleets west over the sunset. 2 of them never came back. So he went on the 3rd one. Now, you're a king, so you got to travel with your army. You got to travel with your retinue. You got to travel with enough food to feed those hundreds of people that are on the fleet with you. So apparently, he never made it back to Mali. But if you remember in Columbus's second voyage, and this is what Van Sertima talks about, in the logs of his second voyage, so he's a king, and so as an example, these are these Zombo Chieftains. So just like in, we have a racial category, which I don't recall I haven't talked to you about this yet, about where racial names come from within a racial group. But from, in Spanish, you have people who can be called blanco, i.e. white, moreno, a little darker, Moor, which in Latin and Greek both mean black, to Zombo, the darkest. Okay, where we get, our little black Sambo. Also, tar baby, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we won't get into ethnic slurs just yet, but these are Zombo Chieftains of Ecuador, descendants of black governors of Ecuador, Zombo Chieftains from Esmeraldas in present-day Ecuador who visited Quito in 1599. They're shown here in Spanish dress and Indian ornaments, but were descendants of a group of 17 shipwrecked Africans who gained political control of an entire province of Ecuador in short order. And this is referenced in chapter 2. So what I want to call your attention to is these spear points. Columbus in his second voyage, when he made first contact with a Taino, and they gave him gold spear points that they had gotten from, as they said, these black guys who came from south across the water, and they referred to the gold spear points as guanin. And when he took the gold spear points back to the king of Portugal, the king of Portugal, oh, that's guanin. He said, yeah, well, that's what those Indians said. And where'd they come from? He said, well, they came from Ghana, because the king of Ghana had gold nuggets big enough to tie a horse to. Chris said, well, I'm the first. Well, no, you're not the first. There were others before you. And also on that voyage, He also mentioned that he saw fleets of Africans, or not fleets, but ships, other ships of dark-skinned Africans going by him, heading away from the American continent. By way of illustrating another type of craft, this is a riverboat in the Gambia, which is also West Africa. He mentioned that Abu Bakari's people plied the rivers in craft like this and supposed that you could make a transatlantic voyage in a ship like this, though he said Abu Bakari did it in warships, considerably more elaborate than just this is essentially a large open canoe. But if the currents were favorable, as he noted they were, and you didn't have a storm, you could probably make it in something like this too. So when we get to the Olmecs in Mexico, now when these large stone heads, one of which is on the cover of the book, were quarried elsewhere from where they were placed in Mexico, and they don't resemble the indigenous people. And there wasn't really any evidence to suggest that they had been conquered by an African people, but they were in either awe or reverence of these folks. Now, each one of these, that head, I mean, if you can see by, well, this is an elephant ears. So let's say the door that you came in, it's double that size. And 10 tons of basalt, quarried and then carried probably by river because they didn't have the wheel to that place in Veracruz. So 10 tons of basalt, basically. So they date back, they've been carbon dated, among other things, back to about 850 BC, which places, if you go with Van Sertima's assumption, that they're inspired by an African presence somewhere around the 22nd or 25th dynasty of Kemet. So the Olmec civilization itself was centered in towns in Veracruz and Tabasco, and thrived from about 1200 BC to around 500 BC. Aspects of Olmec life been found throughout southern Mexico. Called the cultural mother of Mexican civilization, the Olmecs apparently had connections with Africans and quite possibly with Asians, the Chinese of those times also being ocean travelers. And the African ties reflected in the giant stone heads were natural development of strong Atlantic Ocean currents that swept from West Africa into the Caribbean. This is a foot-high statue from the Yucatan, tentatively dated around 800. And if that dating is accurate, it basically shows an African presence that was long after the Olmecs, yet before the arrival of the Spaniards, and it's referred to as La Mulata, which mulatto is a Portuguese slaver term. So it's called that in Spanish, but Portuguese slaver term, which basically means it's a first generation half and half Afro-European mix. I never showed you blood quantum yet. Yes, correct? Okay, we'll get that when we get into American slavery. So consider, Africans did not necessarily come here to try and conquer America, because Africa is bigger than North America. So what we'd be doing is bringing technology, architecture, religion, metallurgy, music and art, gene trading, comparative medical technology. So there are never sufficient numbers to mount a serious invasion, even if they'd been so inclined. Not the idea. We brought our own gold. We didn't come looking for gold. We brought our own gold. We didn't come looking for land. We had Africa. However, we could do technical assistance with some architecture. So, as an example, when I talk about the religion, they have done a language comparison between the Olmec language and the Shi languages and certain languages within West Africa, and found stunning similarities, as well as this particular bird. A little plug here, my blog is called Flight of the Secretary Bird, and the reason it's called that is because the secretary bird is one of, it's a raptor. It's basically in the eagle and hawk family. It lives in Africa, nests in acacia trees, and if you notice, well, basically that bird is like that high, a little over 1.5 meters high. So you notice the long legs, bare feathers. This actually hunts snakes. Now, many raptors can hunt snakes, but there's also the possibility that if you don't get the snake right, it could kill you, right? But a creature adapted to actually hunt gaboon vipers. Remember, in Africa, there's like 13 different types of poisonous snakes, some of which live in trees, black mambas, gaboon vipers, etc. The symbology of this particular raptor eating snakes is one of the things that Van Sertima talks about in terms of the mythology, creating where you put Mexico City. Go to where you see a bird eating a snake. Now, his supposition is that that eagles, and I'm not sure if he's correct in this assumption, but that eagles don't necessarily hunt snakes. They'll hunt other things that are easier prey. But the secretary bird does hunt snakes. And the symbology of this is what basically got transferred in terms of religious transfer in contact between Africans and the indigenous natives at the time around Mexico. The Aztecs, the Aztec pyramids in particular, there were pyramid cities built in America before Africans appeared, assuming they appeared as early as 850 BC. There's definitely pyramid building happening before then. After Africans arrived, archaeologists basically confirmed that the American pyramids built after their arrival, somewhere after 850 BC, took on a north-south orientation like the ones in Kemet. This is also from Van Sertima. In other places in America, Cahokia. So yeah, all this to say, look, dark ages in Europe, not every place is dark. There are people that are building cities. There's civilization here already. So Cahokia, which is in the Midwest, it's a city. This is a view from up above. You can Google on that. It's an aerial. So according to archaeological finds, the city of Cahokia was inhabited from about 700 to 1400, and at its peak from 11 to 12, the city covered nearly 6 square miles. Houses were arranged in rows and around open plazas. The main agricultural fields lay outside the city. The site is named for a sub-tribe of the Illinois, the Cahokia, who occupied the area when the French arrived. Archaeological investigations and scientific tests have provided what is known of the once thriving community. The fate is unknown. They assume, or we assume, the archaeologists assume, there was depletion of resources, probably contributing to the city's decline. And climate change after 1200 may have affected crop production, war, disease, social unrest, any number of things. But anyway, a city. One of the I Googled on pyramids and different pyramids in the world. So this is a cairn in Germany. So previous generations of students said, what do you mean pyramids are only in Africa? Well, you know any place in Europe? So they found this. Okay, all right, but looks like a pile of rocks. What's